Hey, we are live.
Hey, folks, we'll give it one more minute for a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. All right, it's 12:03. We've got a reasonable mob uh, on the webinar, so we'll get rolling here. Good afternoon. I'm Andy Johnson with Defenders of Wildlife. I'd like to wish everyone a happy Sea Otter Awareness Week. As most of you probably know, we celebrate Sea Otter Awareness Week throughout the last full week of December, and we're trying to inspire a deeper awareness of these unique marine mammals, their ecological importance, and also the many challenges they face. We've enjoyed many excellent presentations and events during the past few days of Sea Otter Awareness Week, and they've been based on our theme, this year's theme, Together We Thrive. And today we have another great talk lined up. But first, I'm going to introduce Heather Barrett with Sea Otter Savvy to talk about their We Were Here program.
Thank you so much, Andy. And yes, we're so excited to have you guys all join us here today for yet another amazing virtual event. And we're so thankful that Defenders is always able to host us. And thank you again. But yeah, so this week also highlights Sea Otter Savvy's We Were Here Sea Otter program, which educates communities and stakeholders who are missing sea otters. And we offer a survey for community involvement. The southern sea otter range is currently from Gaviota State Park in the south to Año Nuevo State Park in the north, which is in California. Now, sea otters did once inhabit all along the Pacific coast. They are ecologically and culturally significant, and there's increasing discussion regarding possible reintroduction to historical habitats through Northern California and Oregon. To move forward, government agencies and the sea otter research community need to engage communities and stakeholders to hear your perspectives. So if you're wondering what you can do after this presentation, if you're interested to learn more, please take the Sea Otter Recovery Survey and share your thoughts on possible reintroduction. Your voice matters. The links, the website, and the survey will be made available to you through the chat and at the end and posted with this video. And like I said, we want to hear from all of you, the concerns, the questions, the comments, all of it. So with that, I'm so excited to hear, and I look forward to hearing more from Taylor.
Great, thanks, Heather. So our speaker today is Taylor White. She is a PhD candidate at the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology Department at UC Santa Cruz, advised by Dr. Pete Raimondi. Her research focuses on abalone population dynamics in and around Lingot and Haida Land in Southeast Alaska. She's going to provide maybe a slightly different spin on our theme, Together We Thrive, by describing her research looking at the current status and trajectory of pinto abalone populations across this large region in Southeast Alaska. She'll describe the intensive historical commercial abalone fishery, the return of sea otters to the region, how all those dynamics are working together, and also looking at subsistence harvest and the nuanced perspectives on sea otter hunting, resource management, and coexisting with nature. So I'll present Taylor White. Take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I am very honored to be able to share my research and my story with abalone and sea otters here in Southeast Alaska. Specifically, I'll be focused on Sitka, so I'll be spanning the entire Southeast Alaska, but Sitka, and a lot of this work is some of my dissertation work, but also this more recent community project. So I'd really like to thank the community of Sitka or Shitka, and that is in Tlingit Ani. So this is Tlingit land, and I'd like to say Gunash Chish, thank you to the Tlingit stewards for their ongoing stewardship of this land. So to understand sea otters, I took a route through abalone. So I'm going to talk about abalone a bit, but I promise, sea otters are involved in this as well. And you'll see some really beautiful artwork too throughout. And a lot of this is not mine. Some of the background art is from Jessica Kendallbar, and a lot of the animations that we'll see are from her as well. And the characters like the abalone and the sea otters are all from a artist here, local Kiksadi woman, Hutsi. And so we'll hopefully get to see more of that work. But to get an idea of just my relationship with abalone, growing up here in Sitka, Alaska, I harvested abalone, and I'm very lucky to have been able to do that. But my relationship with sea otters and abalone was sea otters were pretty annoying because they created these kelp forests that I had to swim through to get the abalone. So starting off when I first got in the water, which abalone were a huge motivator of, I saw a lot of urchin barrens, so a lot of these areas to the left here of just very little macroalgal cover. And this is a photo from a more recent dive survey in an area that it would be considered more of an urchin barren without sea otters. But when sea otters are present in the areas of Southeast Alaska and many kelp forested areas, we have this great abundant macroalgal and low canopy cover of kelps. And so there's actually a diver in there as well. I don't know if you can see them, but it's very kelpy. And so for me, growing up, that was frustrating. I couldn't find abalone as easily, but of course, this is a foundational species, this algae, and it's really important, and otters were responsible for that. So I grew up as otters moved into Sitka Sound and was able to see that change in real time and was affected by it. So where am I? I'm in Southeast Alaska right now, and a lot of my research spans this entire area, but specifically in Sitka. So Sitka is at the top of Pinto Abalone's range, which runs all the way down through Washington, California, Point Conception, all the way to Bahia de Tortugas. And this is also the range of sea otters historically. And in fact, the range of sea otters is much larger. It spans all the way through the Aleutians and all the way to Japan. But to say that they coexisted is very real historically. So I wanted to share a little bit of, give my voice a break and pass it along to some of the animation process that we worked with, again, local artists to be able to facilitate a sort of more approachable history to this subject that I only learned about during my dissertation. So it's good for me to know too. So here we go.
Ecosystem changes can happen quickly or over generations. These changes most impact those with a connection to the changed place. Here on Tlingit ancestral land, or Tlingit Ani, there is a saying, when the tide is out, the table is set. The Tlingit are the people of the tides. At low tides, many culturally significant and customary foods like abalone, uncha, are exposed for harvest. Abalone exist all around the world. These marine snails are known for their beautiful shells and as food. In Alaska, abalone are found on the shores of Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian ancestral lands in an area we now call Southeast Alaska. The indigenous people of the area have stewarded their land for thousands of years, managing complex ecosystems thanks to generations of knowledge on species interactions. Interactions like those with sea otters, which historically were abundant in the region. Sea otters consume nearly a quarter of their body weight a day and love to eat shellfish like abalone. To protect these important shellfish, sea otters were strategically removed from areas. This historical indigenous management was interrupted in the late 1700s by the arrival of the Russians, who coordinated the intensive sea otter harvest as a part of the international maritime fur trade. Over 100 years later, nearly all the sea otters were gone. Hope for the sea otter came in the form of the Fur Seal Treaty signed in 1911, which banned sea otter hunting. Unfortunately, this was not enough to recover sea otter populations in Southeast Alaska. While we don't know exactly how abundant abalone and other shellfish were following the historical removal of sea otters, in their absence, shellfish populations grew large enough to support commercial dive fisheries. The abalone dive fishery began in 1964 with a few divers, and harvests steadily increased until peak amounts of harvest in 1979 to 1981, which were followed by a 90% decrease in harvest amount. Still, more divers joined the fishery, but they were catching fewer abalone. Commercial divers and subsistence harvesters complained that abalone were becoming harder and harder to find. Before the fishery even began, there was another big change to the ecosystem. As a conservation measure, sea otters were reintroduced from the Aleutian Islands to select areas of Southeast Alaska in the late 1960s. Otter populations expanded throughout areas of Southeast Alaska, growing at various rates based on their locations. There was shared concern over otters ruining the dive fisheries. However, otters were not documented in commercial abalone locations until after the collapse of the fishery. Otter populations continue to grow and interact with communities in Southeast Alaska in areas of ongoing
subsistence harvest today. So we have now we have growing otter populations throughout Southeast Alaska. And this is the most recent survey and modeled estimates of populations throughout the whole of Southeast Alaska. Like I said, there are many varying growing rates throughout this very dynamic system. So the places that I'm looking at here are Sitka, Alaska, which is where I am, and where sea otters have been generally for the longest period of time established in populations, and where commercial harvest was pretty moderate throughout Sitka, Alaska. So throughout Southeast Alaska, it was largest, actually, it was most intensive in Prince of Wales, which is in the south, in this blue icon here indicating Prince of Wales, and the many sea otter icons indicating a lot of sea otter populations there as well. So the sea otter population growth in Prince of Wales is much greater than in Sitka. And when I was surveying Ketchikan, this is back in 2019, we had no real otter population. So this was an otter absent location. And the historic commercial fishery was intensive, but not as intensive as in Prince of Wales. And so we had our long occupied Sitka of sea otters, then our recently occupied and higher density population in Prince of Wales, and then in Ketchikan there were no otters. And so how did this relate to our abalone populations in these areas, knowing that they eat a lot of shellfish? So beyond otters, how about humans? How's their relationship with abalone? Well, we still have a current ongoing subsistence harvest for pinto abalone in Southeast Alaska. As a resident, you were allowed 5 per day in possession, but that is down from 50 per day per person in 2013. And that changed after precipitous declines of abalone populations. They were just getting harder and harder to find throughout the regions, but also throughout their range. They were petitioned to be listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act, which in Southeast Alaska, a lot of folks were looking around, seeing abalone in places and wondering why this listing was necessary here. But of course, they would have to list them throughout their entire range. So the listing was denied, and we still are allowed 5 per day per person, and it's ongoing. So how in the heck are Alaska abalone doing with sea otters and with humans consistently interacting with the populations? Well, that was partially my dissertation, was to really figure out what's going on with these populations currently, because the last surveys were done in the 70s, and that was during the fishery historically. And so there's really limited baseline data, and this is my first way of knowing Western science. As many of us who work in any scientific field know, there are a lot of limitations to what is known in these spaces and what data has been collected. And so there's limited ongoing harvest information as well. There's no requirement for reporting how many abalone you have gathered. It's also really complex because this complex ecosystem, there are many islands. People can just go to their beach, which is wonderful, and collect abalone and not necessarily have to go to an office and report it. Plus, sea otters surveys have been done recently in 2022, and those models were in 2023, sort of hindcasting a lot of the timelines when aerial surveys were just not able to be done. Again, it's a very big system. It's hard to do these huge surveys, and I'm grateful for the data we do have now. But we have a gap of data of 10 years when the otter populations actually really grew quite a lot. And so we don't really know when they occupied an area and sort of what that impact was. And then also in Southeast Alaska, the communities use this space. Again, when the tide is out, the table is set, right? So we have a lot of folks harvesting in the same species and in the same areas as sea otters. So we don't really understand those localized impacts. Here's the available historical data that I was lucky enough to have in Southeast Alaska. And you really don't need to pay too much attention to this plot. The main point is there are many more large abalone in this area. So I went to where this site was and a bunch of other historical time swim sites in southern Southeast Alaska. So that was in Prince of Wales and in Ketchikan. And I redid these time swim surveys and found that there are far fewer abalone. So there aren't numbers here, but there are magnitudes less abalone in these areas than there were historically in the 70s and the 80s. And so the historical surveys are in blue, and this line here at 89 millimeters is the current minimum legal limit. And then the current abalone populations here in the ones that I surveyed are in orange and are much smaller, and there are far fewer large abalone. And Gravina Island is technically Ketchikan here, where otters had not yet established when I was doing these surveys, and they show the least reduction in large and legal abalone. So some potential compounding effects of sea otters, we're not quite sure, but the interesting thing is following the closure of the fishery in Ketchikan, those abalone populations did not really rebound, as you would hope. So throughout Southeast Alaska, it's a range of densities here and some really strange anomalies in our densities of abalone populations. So this is currently, we have many, many more abalone in Sitka, and many, many more is very relative to other areas in Southeast and throughout the range. It's hard to say whether that's enough to support what is being harvested, but we have more abalone relative to the rest of Southeast Alaska in Sitka. And again, that's where the otters have been established the longest. And in Prince of Wales, this blue, these letters basically indicate that these three regions are very different. So this blue and C is the lowest densities of abalone. There are very few, hit hard by the commercial fishery and otters, potentially. And then in Ketchikan, which is strange, we don't have more abalone than Sitka. There are no sea otters. There is still ongoing subsistence and personal use, technically personal use harvest there. So what in the heck is going on with these populations? What's really interesting is that throughout, and really, really important for abalone populations, is that throughout the areas, we see this recruitment. So these shaded areas here below 40 millimeters, these are proportions of abalone recorded. We're finding a lot of little guys, which is important to sustain the abalone populations, but not a lot of big guys. So, which is important for folks who want to harvest them, and also otters who would prefer a larger meal. So abalone persist in the presence of sea otters, and following commercial harvest, but especially areas that have been hit heavily by commercial harvest, they are not doing as great. And there are really significant local differences in populations that are really managed throughout Southeast Alaska exactly the same. And again, very few historical and baseline data. The anomaly, Sitka, which is, of course, I'm a little biased, it's where I am right now, but we set up monitoring sites here back in 2015 and have been monitoring them yearly up until 2021. There are some new monitoring sites, which I'm happy are still being surveyed in Sitka Sound, but for these monitoring sites, we found an increase in abalone generally, but that increase in densities of abalone really was increased in small abalone sizes. So you can hardly see it here, but the green legal abalone, legal for harvest, are not increasing in densities throughout time, but the little guys are somehow managing to make it. So, and then this line here that's at 0.02 abalone per meter squared is the sort of reproductive threshold. So if abalone are below that, it's thought that they are not reproductively viable. So often the smaller guys are above that, but we need more large and legal ones. So that's kind of that wraps my dissertation work, but I'm just going to take a sip of tea and thank a bunch of people for all of that work that then sort of spawned this next research community project. So thank you to them. And back to this, because folks were telling me in the community, as a local, as a researcher, as a abalone harvester, folks really wanted to tell me what was going on with their local abalone harvest sites. And so, yes, they were seeing increases in abalone as well, and had been noting it for years, and I was able to document it subtitly, but we had different levels of with just very different spatially specific harvest trends. And that got me very curious, and folks were very willing to share their very sensitive information about their harvest sites. And so I wanted to do it in a good way where I could look at these changes and incorporate community perspectives in abalone populations throughout Sitka Sound. And so here we have some characters that Sienna Hutzi modeled here for us to navigate these diverse knowledge types. So we have Western science, which has its limitations, as we know and as I discovered more, and local knowledge, which is a different lens of viewing the area. We have local experts who have been harvesting for many, many years and really know their backyards better than most people. And especially when folks are harvesting in their backyards, they really get that connection to a place. And that's hugely important information. And then indigenous knowledge, which is generations of knowledge accumulated over time, and that includes some adaptive management, so knowledge of that as otters again move into an area. What do we do with them? Well, under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, there's opportunity to remove, but also to use in traditional customary ways, sea otters and abalone. And so all of these knowledge types exist in Sitka, and it's beautiful, and I'm incredibly humbled by it. And it's really important that we uphold all of them with the same amount of impact and care, because they really do create this holistic view of Sitka Sound. And this is true, in many, many places. I'm just lucky to be here. So we created this project called Ways of Knowing Abalone and Sea Otters, or Sea Otters and Abalone, depending on your focus. And the goal of it was really to develop this collective understanding of the current and historical and potential predictive future dynamics of abalone and sea otters in local spaces that are really important to the harvesters themselves. And in so doing, support the tribal and stakeholder sovereignty of the management of these important species, because a lot of this information is, again, very sensitive, but has also been collected and known through time, and is really important that sticks with the folks who share it and is not owned by a university, or is really archived respectfully. And that was a huge and important part of this. And a lot of this project really was collaborative with Sitka Tribe of Alaska and non-tribal citizens as well, who are local experts in the area in general, but also these species. So there's a lot of ongoing conversation there. And the project itself involved 25 individuals. I wish I could talk to many more. I know many more would love to be included on this, and I will be talking to many more folks, which I love. But 7 of them are sea otter harvesters, 5 tour guides, 5 were ex-commercial fishers, so commercial divers who actually had such great stories of the dive fisheries throughout Southeast Alaska. Tour guides, of course, brought the really unique perspective of wanting sea otters in areas and then also noticing those changes as they were giving tours over time in the densities and behaviors of sea otters. So that was incredibly important. Otter harvesters were able to provide a lot of information on the behaviors also on sea otters, and then if they were harvesting males or females was really important for the different behaviors that otters have. So females can be more homebodies in one location, and males can be more scouts and moving around. And so talking about those behaviors and that knowledge was hugely important. Great. And so in terms of the interviews themselves, I would ask folks to whatever degree they feel comfortable to share information on their abalone harvest sites and to map that out. And I have information at these small scales, which are actually not incredibly small, but I make that, but I expand out that information much larger for all public presentations. So I'm not providing any small scale information on people's local harvest sites at all. And that is pretty much under lock and key and triple coded. But what was really great was to see and hear about changes to these very specific areas throughout Sitka Sound. And this also included sea otter harvest in these local areas. So we had the removal of abalone and the removal of sea otters and where. Then we also had otter occupation, which was hugely important. Like I said, we had over 10 years of no sea otter surveys, and there was a lot of movement. That was really crux time for movement throughout some of these areas in Sitka Sound in Southeast Alaska. And so to get more local scale occupation of otters was important, as occupation time can also lend to changes in otter behavior. So when otters have occupied an area for a long time, they're thought to be more specialists, so less grab whatever is calorically abundant and good for you, and more they're in their space. They maybe have learned a particular species that they're eating now. So it sort of spreads out the sort of breadth of their impact in an ecosystem. Right, and then management recommendations, which were really, really important to hear from the community and record. Right, so ways of knowing, we found so much information, which was wonderful, and really extended this timeline of recorded information back into the 40s in terms of what were the abalone populations like. Were there many of them in this area? Were there few of them in this area? And again, sea otter occupation throughout the sound. So what we can see here in this graph, which is really just highlighting that, is that in red, we have this Western science information that I've been working with that goes just, I believe this is Kelp Watch data that goes past maybe some otter harvest information, but it's, I think, 2003 on, and then we have just so much more information. And things like indigenous knowledge do not fit in a graph like this, and we're not included in a graph like this. So this is, there was a real big conversation with the tribe as well to understand how to pair and incorporate these knowledge systems. So there are storylines that go in tandem with this. Right, so timing and consequences of sea otter return. Many folks are really concerned about reestablishing sea otters, as I was annoyed in high school because they created all this kelp. Gosh darn it, that is not really the problem. There's also a lot of folks who were frustrated by the decline of shellfish and things that were really important to them. So a lot of folks reported as soon as they saw a sea otter enter their area, where did everything go? And they do have a really significant impact in the areas that they reestablish. But what was really interesting was how that changed over time. And also what was really interesting was folks were really telling on themselves here. And I really appreciate the honesty of this community in understanding that we have a really intensive impact on this ecosystem as well. Excuse me. And so this graph here is the mean amount of reported many abalone and across sea otter occupation times. So in blue is pre-sea otter occupation to a local site that a person has identified. In red is this occupation period, where we defined that as otters initially occupy an area. That can be sort of the start of the occupation period, and then to a sort of growing regular presence of sea otters is the end of the otter occupation period, and then after is post-otter occupation. Excuse me. So what we're finding is that there's a decrease in the 80s, around when that commercial fishery stopped. Of course, the commercial fishery was actually not going on in Sitka Sound. There was a lot of subsistence harvest, though, and a lot of diving that was allowed during the early 80s and late 70s. So you could scuba dive for abalone, which was a really effective way to gather them. And so in the 90s, we saw this real sharp decline in many legal abalone to harvest. And that was before the occupation period. And so folks really were on the anti-otter bandwagon, pointing fingers at sea otters for really doing some damage to these abalone populations, but it wasn't really necessarily the otters, right? So there was that initial impact that I think was really noticeable and seen by those folks who saw otters on their harvest sites and then couldn't go back to harvest abalone right away. And what was really interesting, again, is post-otters, once otters had occupied an area, we had this increase in many abalone that were available. So that was interesting. So what's going on after some time of otter establishment? Well, potentially sea otters through really complicated, not very complicated, but indirect pathways have really facilitated the kelps in the area. Excuse me. And it really pointed to this community held belief that I also had when I started to even research abalone, that sea otters have this really exclusively negative impact on our environment, that because they're changing it, and that would really impact all the shellfish populations. And these shellfish populations that I knew growing up were due to the removal of sea otters, that they were able to be just so dense and abundant. And so that was a challenge to overcome that sort of community held belief of the negative belief of sea otters impacting populations negatively. And as we see through, this is, excuse me, adult abalone density and distance from Sitka on the x-axis. We see far fewer abalone in areas nearer town than areas farther from town. And areas farther from town were identified as having more sea otters as well. So areas with more sea otters farther from town, farther from easy access from human harvest, were doing far better than in areas near town. And again, this is from this likely interactions with otters eating urchins, which are eating the kelps that abalone also need to survive. And so in removing those urchins, the kelps can thrive and abalone can also thrive and potentially grow in abundance. So a recap of these ways of knowing, excuse me, and some of these collaborative findings that were really eye-opening for me too, as a local, was that this perceived negative impact of sea otters is just not what's happening with current abalone and otter interactions. So Sitka has an overall higher density of abalone, potentially because of this long occupation of sea otters. And that's it's really hard to pinpoint direct interactions and direct causes of sea otters, but there is definitely a positive interaction of this of sea otters and abalone in Sitka Sound. And then, of course, these large-scale interactions are really complicated, and they're really much better informed at larger and local scales, where the harvesters of abalone and sea otters are able to really tell you what they know and have seen over time in the changes at these scales that then can be expanded out to larger management and less mono management of abalone, perhaps. And a lot of the interactions, the sort of negative factors impacting abalone were really tied to humans. Then we had sea stars, birds, other weasel species, and then a lot of other effects, but really humans are pointed to as one of the more intensive impacts on abalone populations. So I'll sort of end a little bit early with this concept that paired knowledge is really allowing for a better understanding and mutual benefit for all of us when we do intentionally and with respect and support of all these ways of knowing. So I'd like to say Gunesh Chish, thank you, Hoa, to all those individuals that were involved in this community project. And excuse me for my voice going, but if you'd like to know more about it, you should definitely check out akabalone.com. You can contact me there, and I'm happy to talk more about abalone anytime, but also sea otters as they relate to abalone. And that is my presentation. So I'm really grateful for everyone showing up.
That was great. Thank you so much, Taylor. That was beyond fascinating especially for those of us who've worked with sea otters a long time. Sorry, your voice is cutting out, but we'll see if we can keep it going a bit longer with some questions. And I hope everyone can really appreciate the long-term nature of your work, that it really takes such a long time to monitor the habitat dynamics and acquire all the data. Engaging with the sensitive commercial fishing and tribal communities is key to this work. It's such a challenge to even access those communities and try and locate this data, particularly when a lot of the data hasn't been collected over a long time. But really documenting the positive effects on sea otters on nearshore ecosystems, even on species like abalone, is such an important finding. It's so interesting. So we have a few questions that have come in. The first, you touched on it a bit, but has your relationship with abalone changed since you started surveying them? And maybe describe how your that relationship has changed.
Yeah, thank you for the question. My relationship with abalone initially was really just grab them, get in the ocean. It was a positive way that I was able to interact with the ocean and sort of learn about ways to, I guess, feed yourself with the ocean. But it has changed significantly in more recent years, where I've been able to really understand the cultural and traditional importance of abalone populations, and also knowing in areas south, like in Haida Gwaii, in areas of Washington, all other areas, folks can't harvest abalone. So how very special it is that we are still able to eat them. And I know that the cultural significance of it has really stuck with me, and the privilege of being able to harvest them as a white settler who does not have that connection in history with this particular species beyond them getting me in the ocean. So it's been quite a change in full circle of really appreciating them in a different way.
That's great. I think yeah, I hesitate from using terms like exploding myths, but there are certainly a lot of beliefs about sea otters that they come in and just mow through everything, and but also obviously people know that sea otters are quite important in terms of increasing productivity of areas like kelp forests and eelgrass zones and estuaries. So getting to the bottom of this, and I think I always hesitate to mischaracterize anything, but I believe Dr. Raimundi found something similar in around San Nicolas Island with black abalone and sea otters. I don't know if you have information on that you could touch on, or
yeah, I can try. Yeah. So I believe what you're referring to is that when otters occupied an area in the Channel Islands, that abalone were able to benefit again from that kelp, and were just more often hidden in cracks and crevices. So there's this behavioral change that was seen that we also documented in these areas. So in areas, I wonder if I have, well, no, but in areas of Southeast Alaska, there are those varying amounts of sea otters, and we found really different changes in the abalone behavior of refuge-seeking behavior, I guess. So it did change, where in Sitka, there are a lot of hidden abalone, and there are long occupations of sea otters, and again, that kelp. So it's the similar story as to what you're just describing with Pete's work. Abalone know to hide from otters, and then they can be in refuge because there's more kelp that's just going to drift down to them, instead of having to go out and actively look for their food when there's an urchin barren and there's a lot less macroalgae, because those urchins are really great competitors and really good consumers of algae. And so they have to compete together. And so you'll find abalone more out in the open, perhaps looking for food, or because there aren't sea otters in areas without otters.
yeah, it's kind of extraordinary to hear these stories that how sea otters maybe protect or enhance the system, its biodiversity and the biomass within the system, but also there are the challenges of maybe those areas then are considered maybe healthier, but maybe are no longer able to support commercial fisheries. So that in that lies, I think, the biggest challenge as sea otters return, and as we talk about things like reintroducing sea otters to areas where they were extirpated. In your work with looking at abalone, have you noticed other benefits that otters provide that help other species besides abalone?
Yeah, I mean,
That makes sense.
definitely the macroalgal populations. So where they are, where otters are, there is definitely more algae. So that's important again as a foundation species. And it's less in my sphere, but I definitely see it. You see in those first photos that there's just a lot of tegulus, all these snails, and then there's more fish in that so it creates this foundation of just a diverse environment. And so it has to be helping a lot of other species as well. Having sea otters. And it really depends on, I guess, on what, what you're looking for. Are you looking for urchin barrens that where they're eating the diatoms on this beautiful crusted coralline rock, or are you looking at these abundant kelp forests that sea otters are able to create? And so there's real stark differences in that species composition, and I think a lot of benefit when otters are in an area for a more diverse species composition.
Yeah, I think we had a kind of a question or a comment, just sort of double checking that sea otters eat sea urchins, which then allows the kelp to flourish. This also allows the abalone to flourish as well. Is that the correct takeaway?
Yes. And yes, I really rushed through this. Apologies, but I would say that's a great summary. Otters have a sort of negative impact on when they're removing urchins from the ecosystem, and then that means that there are fewer urchins, so fewer urchins that are eating kelp. That allows the kelp to flourish, and then abalone really benefit from that, and don't have to compete as readily for their food with sea urchins as they would have to if otters weren't around.
Got it.
Yeah.
This next question kind of maybe gets at the crux of some of the most challenging aspects of sea otters returning. In your experience, or as you've worked through your research, to what extent do local fishermen or tribal subsistence fishers now believe that sea otters are a positive for abalone and even other fish species for fish species abundance?
Yeah,
Do you think any of those attitudes are changing or beliefs?
Well, what is really, I think, beautiful about just folks who are really connected to the ecosystem is they really see that change. And they do, I mean, I can't say definitively any percentage has changed, but I will say that folks who commercially harvested abalone really saw the damage that was being done when it was happening, and they really did notice their impact and the impact of the fisheries on abalone. And a lot of them pointed fingers per se at sea otters because sea otters were coming into the area sort of after they had already impacted it. But after a while, it did take a while, I will say. And actually, it was usually at the end of a lot of my interviews that folks would admit that sea otters like are really not the problem and potentially more beneficial. And that wasn't in every case, but a lot of folks, because they pay very honest attention to their backyard, we're noticing that. So it was really cool to like come full circle and tell their backstory with otters as sort of the one that I had perceived that they were, yeah, not necessarily good for any shellfish. But over time and potentially over occupation time, when they lessen their effects on all these shellfish, folks really did see that and acknowledged it in a lot of ways, in so many words.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, these folks who their livelihood depends on being able to harvest these species, and if sea otters come in and chow down, it's quite a thing to maybe get over that resistance that sea otters are totally a negative thing, and maybe are positive for the system, even perhaps if it's harming their own industry, but in areas where it seems like everything's benefiting. That's quite a positive. That question came from Sam. I wanted to mention that. I've been forgetting to mention names of our questioners. Wendy had a question initially asking what the term sea otter, or sorry, what the term otter harvesters are. Was that the original question? So I've got about three different places where these are. Yeah, what does the term otter harvester mean? And then she followed it up with questioning whether those are people who are working on sea otters and tagging and release otters. What does that term mean to you?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the clarifying question, Wendy. Again, living in this environment, it's very easy to just accept of otter harvesters. Well, what I'm mentioning here is that sea otter harvesters are otter hunters, and they are removing them from the system in ways that are traditional and customary to. So it's all Alaska natives. You must be Alaska native to hunt sea otters, and it is based off of this clause that was put into the Marine Mammal Protection Act, allowing that, and is a really important connection to a species that was removed from the culture completely when the extirpation of sea otters in the late 1800s happened throughout the range for the fur trade, but in Southeast Alaska, that connection was broken. And so sea otter harvesters today are able to reconnect with this species, and that involves hunting. So that's what that means.
Do you feel as though that's a kind of a technique along with harvesting sea otters, but that's viewed as a way to maybe balance out the sea otter's impact on some of these areas in terms of protecting shellfish for subsistence or even commercial harvesting? That makes sense.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, and I have been told that, and it is indigenous knowledge that the adaptive management of like sea otter movement into an area, folks would remove otters from an area, say like a clam garden or a harvested area, to remove the effects of otters. So it's much like gardening for their much necessary food, and you have to keep the pests out in a way. I guess that's not necessarily, that's my take on it, and that folks do suggest that that is why they harvest harvest otters as well today. Um, and yeah, and shellfish populations have fluctuated, they've increased. Whether or not that's directly due to that is something that I'm looking at actively and going to work with the tribe more on. So
Gotcha. Kind of another follow-up on that same track from Megan. Do you know if there are other traditional ecological knowledge techniques, traditions within the tribal communities on limiting number of sea otters in abalone hunting grounds, other than just lethal removal?
I personally don't. I've heard of scare tactics, which I'm not 100% sure on, so I don't really know if I'm informed enough to say much. But what I will say is that when areas are hunted, there is this sphere ecology where otters will avoid spaces, and so that is known, and really helpful in terms of just the behavior of otters will change, and so they can support their populations by just moving to a different place, and folks can have their abundant shellfish in their absence and coexist as they have for over 10,000 years before they were removed.
Yeah, I think that idea of not having to maybe remove a lot of sea otters, but maybe as you say, the scare tactics, maybe there is one or two otters that are removed, and that kind of encourages the other otters to move away, so it's not such an impact. Just one last question. How do you hope your research will influence future studies or management of sea otters and abalone?
Well, I think that it's been most important to talk with the people who are really involved with the ecosystem. And so I love the survey. If you're taking the survey, if you're a community member who's involved in any of these species, I think it's really important to feel like your voice is actually being heard and upheld, but also to be involved in the management of these species. It's really complex interactions, and I think I feel for managers who have to manage these really complicated ecosystems and to know what's happening at these small scales, it really takes a lot of effort and a lot of trust and community work. And so I would really like, especially as otters move into areas, say like in Ketchikan and just south, sort of tracking that movement instead of having to sort of hindcast what was happening. And it was great to talk with folks that really were knowledgeable about what happened directly after a sea otter moved into their area. Some folks were like, it was May of this because I recall. And so, I mean, you get all those great stories, but you also really get all this very important information to managing. And if we can start with community members as otters move into an area and really do more of that community work and have those conversations, because that was one of the key things as well that folks said. They just want to avoid that initial impact of sea otters. But after that initial impact, there are a lot of positive things that come from it. And so just to document those, and I think that will help ease any concerns over otters and also provide just a ton more information for management. So more community-based research and upholding of different ways of knowing, because clearly Western science is limited. And we're not data mining community members. It's really if they want to provide information and if they feel comfortable sharing their local expertise, I think it's really a beautiful opportunity for that.
Well said. So important. I think we discussed before the presentation. That's kind of what's happening in Haida Gwaii, just south of you, where they are kind of ahead of the curve in this case, where they're doing a lot of documentation as sea otters move into the area again. So fascinating stuff. Thanks so much to Taylor. That was great. I want to extend a quick reminder. Please attend tomorrow's noontime presentation, Sea Otters in Kashaya territory, where members of the Kashaya Band of Pomo Indians will share their history and cultural relationships with sea otters in California, or in their former territories, describing impacts of the fur trade, the lack of coastal access in Kashaya community, a lot of the effects that they've experienced in their history, both negative and positive. And Heather, did you want to make one last plea?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you so much, Taylor, for sharing this, and everything you've been talking about is excellent, and thank you so much for sharing it. Yes, don't forget to join us tomorrow, and then also everyone's voice matters, whether that be concerns, questions. We want to hear from all of you. This survey is public right now. There's a link in here. We're going to add it into the video that's on YouTube as well for those that are tuning in there. So please share your voice if you're interested. It doesn't matter where you're from. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Yes, thanks for all the folks who tuned in on the webinar here and on the YouTube live stream. And we posted the Defenders website link where you can go and check out other events. There are a lot of local events along the West Coast in terms of going out and seeing sea otters at spotting stations and so forth. A few other live events. There's also a silent auction going on through the Alaka Alliance. So if you want to see some sea otter art and bid on that, go for it. Otherwise, I think we're pretty well wrapped up. So thanks again, Taylor. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Jacqueline, behind the scenes for us. And we will see you at other Sea Otter Awareness Week events.